Halito, everyone. Welcome back to Chahta. I'm Megan Baker, your host. And so today we have our first session in our new series called Chahta Elder Stories. In this sub-series, we'll be joined by Chahta elders who will share a little bit about themselves, their families, and any kind of stories that they would like to share. So, as many of you kind of know, our Chahta community is very kind of diverse. And through this series, we kind of want to help our communities to learn about each other and our kind of families, because we're all, as we will often find out, probably related to one another or something like that. And so a major part of the Choctaw story is that of our Oklahoma communities, which has been the driving force for much of our Choctaw history. One of the things that I often tell people in my research and my work is that Choctaw history is foundational to understanding contemporary Oklahoma and the United States. And so I think reflecting on our lives as Choctaw people can help us see how that's true. The things that we take for granted and are part of our everyday lives can have important insights into wider society and culture. So this is in part why stories with Chahta elders are particularly important to us today. So when I talk to people about my research about Choctaw Nation, people often don't think that not insignificant things happened in their lives. But as we will see through this kind of series, there is lots of things about Choctaw history that we can learn about just by reflecting on our past. So I grew up with the stories of our first speaker for this series. As maybe some of you have already figured out, Robert Baker is my dad. And so he is our first Choctaw elder story. And so much of what the stories that he told me kind of growing up, I've kind of internalized and learned from. And it's been really important to my own thinking as a Choctaw historian and scholar who's trying to document our history today. So Robert Baker is a Choctaw community member from Baptiste. He is a Choctaw first language speaker who later went on to join the Marines, and he worked as a counselor in higher education in California. Growing up, he always instilled in my sister and I the value of family and knowing where we come from as Choctaw people. So this often meant summers and winter breaks spent in Oklahoma with our grandparents, uncles, and cousins. And so we learned a lot about who Choctaw people are and what they're kind of like. So I kind of wanted to share the experience of knowing my dad with kind of all of you. So we're just kind of going to have some questions and he's going to talk. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or the question and answer. All right, does that sound good? All right, so first question, Mr. Baker, who's your family and where are you all from?
I'm the third child of Aaron and Juanita Baker. I was born in Broken Bow. I grew up in Baptiste. My father was born in Baptiste and he lived there all his life. So when my mother, she was born in Broken Bow, and her family is the Billy family. Her father was Simon Billy, and he was the pastor at Okochukma Church, Presbyterian Church. And then grandfather Baker, he was a pastor at Bethel Hill Church. It used to be called Old Bethel. Now, both ministers or pastors, they were circuit riders. What this means, for example, is that grandfather Baker, he had 6 churches assigned to him within the Buktukla circuit, which is not called the Buktukla circuit now. And he went to each one of these churches during the week when he conducted services on weekends, on Sundays. And the same thing, grandfather Billy did the same thing. But I understand that, he also used the train. Sometimes he would ride the train from Broken Bow to perhaps Valiant. and then he would walk from there to the church. Now, each church had a parsonage, so they always had a place to stay. But later on, I'll get into that later. My dad had brothers and sisters. Well, Anderson Winship was that my dad's brothers. Anderson Winship. There was Dan Baker, Walter, Floyd, James, and Owen. Now, Dan, Floyd, and Jimmy, or James, they were World War II veterans. Uncle Owen was Korea. And my dad, Aaron Baker, he served with the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. So having that on my side of the family, on the Baker side of the family, and then on the Billy side of the family, my mother, Juanita Baker, she went to Dwight Mission. And her brothers and sisters were Alice James, Gracie Billy, Sam Billy, Daniel Billy, Ed Billy, and Cleland Billy. Now, Daniel was in the Army, and he was Korea. And then Cleland, we used to call him Farmer, the youngest. He served in Vietnam. So each one of these aunts and uncles, they were, I think I could fairly say that, they were avid thinkers, always thinking about tomorrow. And anytime we were with them, it was always, you need to learn how to do this. I'll show you how to do this. They were always explaining things. So when we grew up, myself, I had my older brother, Aaron Jr., older sister, Lois, younger sister, Joyce, younger brother, Harold, younger brother, Daryl, younger sister, Anita Carroll, we call her Sue, and then there was Cecil Ray. And each one of us, we were encouraged to always try to do a little bit more than what was asked of us. So we kind of grew up that way, and we were always thinking about, doing things for ourselves. And I think, that made a difference in the way we lived, because I know that my mom and dad's thinking, the way I think about it today, is that their thinking was progressive. They were always thinking about tomorrow, so they always pushed us to think about tomorrow. And whenever I was talking about progressive, I'm talking about education. They were constantly pushing education. So if we wanted to do something probably for some families it was considered out of the ordinary, they would always say, okay, if you know what you're doing, and then they would allow us to do whatever it is we wanted to do. So most of the time, if I wanted to do something, I'd say, Mom, I'm going to go do this. And, she'd look at me and says, you know what you're doing? I said, yeah, I think so. Okay. So I would be able to go and do that. And I know that in some families, kids my age weren't allowed to do a lot of things that we did. It's like going to ball games. If I wanted to go to ball game, I started going to ball games at a very early age. Sometimes I'd want to go to a ball game. I didn't have any money. Then she'd say, well, you're going to have to do something to get the money. So I'd have to find something to do. But in addition to that, my mom, she cut hair, she did permanents, she ironed clothes for usually most of the faculty at Batiste High School. She ironed clothes for them. And my dad, he cut hair. He was a part-time barber. But he also worked for the state of Oklahoma Forestry Division. So sometimes on the way home, he'd stop and give a haircut. He always carried his barber tools. These are the hand clippers. Uh, so he'd always carry that with him. So if someone wanted a haircut, you know, they could stop anywhere and he would just give them a haircut. And that's just the way things were where we grew up. Is that a lot of the stuff, there was no such thing as appointments or I'll do this tomorrow. If they could do it, they just did it right then and there. So my dad was a barber, and he was, I think it would be fair to say, he was pretty much a handyman in a lot of different trades. He could do a lot of things. So he was always in demand in terms of finding little odd jobs. And my mom, she had some formal education. So I think that within the Choctaw community, in Batiste community, people kind of saw her as someone who is a little educated than most. So people would come to the house, and they would want her to either read letters that they had received and answer letters for them. She did. Sometimes she would go to the store with them and interpret and negotiate things with the store owner, things of this sort. So they were pretty much involved in the community at all times. So we always had people at the house, people coming to get a haircut. And then we had some people who live further down the road. And sometimes they would, the ladies would stop by with magazines and they would trade with mom. So we always had reading material. And sometimes, they would stop by and say, "What day do you need anything from store?" And then they'd go to the store, and then they'd come back, drop it off, and go on home. Things of this sort. Everything was pretty much community based, it seemed like. So I grew up being around people all the time. There used to be a couple of Choctaw ladies who used to come and stay with us for 3-4 days. And, they would just talk. And I remember them because one lady in particular, she would always wear a long dress. It was usually light blue, and she'd always have a white apron. And now I realize that was a Choctaw dress. But I used to see her wear that all the time, and she would walk from Pickens, and Pickens is probably about 5 miles away. She would walk from Pickens and come stay with us for, I don't know, 4 or 5 days, and then she'd go back home. And another lady, Miss Ida, she would also come and stay with us for 4 or 5 days, and then sometimes she would go back to Tulsa and stay with her daughter, and then come down every now and then. So we always had people visiting us. And the good part about having the people visit us is that we always heard all kinds of stories. We always knew what was going on. We always had an idea of what was going on in the community because, as a kid, people don't pay too much attention to you. So, you could be sitting there listening and until all of a sudden they call you and they say, "Don't you go play?" But I learned a lot of things from those days, just being there. Does that kind of answer your question about what you asked?
Yeah, and you answered more than that.
Okay.
Well, could you tell us a little bit more about Batiste as a kind of community? Because I know a lot of it, Choctaw communities are around churches and people kind of gather that way. And so could you say a little bit about that?
Batiste, it's a small town. Actually, it's not even a town. Whenever I was real small, there used to be 2 stores there, one across the street from each other. And also that's where the Batiste High School is located. And Batiste it's pretty much center of outlying communities. There's North Bethel, there's South Bethel, and then there's Sherwood, and then there's Mount Hermon to the east. And to the west of Baptiste, it's a Mount Silver Creek community, and then the Mount Zion community, and then a little further down the road is called Pickens, and then there's Cleveland. Cleveland was the pole yard or the log yard for Derrick's at that time, Derrick's tree company. So what the loggers would do is that they would haul logs to Cleveland to the pole yard, then they would unload their trucks there, and the logs would be loaded onto a train, and then the train would take it to Wright City. So that's how that works. So most people who lived in Baptiste were either loggers or they hauled poles. Poles, when I say poles, they're only about maybe 6 feet or 8 feet or 10 feet long. And then logs would usually be anywhere from, I don't know, 15, 20 feet, and probably about, in those days, they used to be huge. So there were loggers, then there were ranchers, and then there were farmers. And then there was the Derrick's headquarters, not too far from Baptiste. And then there was the Oklahoma State Division of Forestry, where my dad worked. And so that was pretty much the people who lived in Baptiste. So what would happen is that everybody pretty much knew everybody. Everything was based on trust. So the focal point of Baptiste was the Baptiste store. The store owner was also the postmaster. So on any given day other than Sunday, Baptiste post office was the meeting place for noon. That's when the mail came in. So a lot of people who were off that day or who weren't working would always converge on the store. Benny Davis was the owner. Benny Davis, in my mind, when I think about that today, is that he was the mayor, he was the unofficial banker, he was the unofficial communication chief. You name it, he done everything because he was dependent on the community, and the community was dependent on him because he offered credit. My father, he was paid monthly, so he would give my dad credit and he would pay up at the end of every month. And most of the people who lived around there were paid monthly, so either around the 1st, and then other people got paid around the 10th. So those 2 days, the store would be full of people. And what Benny would do is that if you want to leave a message for my father, sometimes, some families would say, tell Aaron, I got 6 heads, tomorrow night if he can come over. And then Benny would either tell me or one of my brothers and sisters, if he saw us, to tell your dad the little boys got 6 heads tomorrow. What that meant is that he would have all his boys and brothers there, and dad, if he come over there, he could cut 6 heads. So my dad, once he bought his pickup, he didn't have a pickup for a long time, but once he bought his pickup, he would go to different places. And then they'd do that. And that was a standard thing. Or sometimes they'd say, Aaron, can you give me a haircut? I need to do something tomorrow. And sometimes, he would, if he had his hand clippers, he would do it then. But Benny also had told Dad that, if he got some electric clippers, he could use the back stock room, to cut hair. So sometimes, he would get off work at 5, and then Benny would say, Aaron, I got 5, 6 people here waiting for you. And, he would go back in the stock room and cut hair. So it was that kind of a community in which we lived, where people sort of look after everybody. People who knew everybody, would always be, if someone was sick, there would be, you knew that you could get help. And teachers were considered, they were kind of on a pedestal because they were teachers, and everybody kind of deferred to them because they were educated. So, so in a way that was good, because I remember, I guess I must have been about 7 or 8. I broke my wrist, and Dad just went to the superintendent's house and said and got him to take me to Talahina, and that's where I got my treatment. So if you needed something, people were willing to help. Sometimes Dad would say, he would come home and say, I need a water pump, or I need this, I need a carburetor for the pickup. And he would say, tomorrow, Shug is going to town. He's going to headquarters in Brokenwood tomorrow. If you'll be at the store, he'll pick you up and he'll take you. Then he'll bring you back around 3:30 whenever he's on his way back. And I would be at the store waiting, and then I would ride with him to Broken Bow. He would drop me off, and then I would go to Uncle Ed's house and wait for him. And then Uncle Ed and I would go someplace, and he would buy this part, and he gave it to me, and then I would come back. So things of that sort. So we were kids probably, but we grew up with responsibilities. So whenever I think about leaving home, I left home at 17. I was probably thinking more like I was a 25-year-old, because everybody had chores. All kids, it was not unusual to see an 8-year-old driving down the road, the tractor, because I started driving a hay truck. What would happen is that since I would always go to the store, sometimes there was Daryl Kaiser had a ranch, and he would always have his hands either hauling hay or doing something, or doing ranch work. And sometimes I'd be at the store, and Jonas Watson was a Chahta guy from Mount Zion. Sometimes he'd see me, he said, we have to go over here by where your dad works, and he said we get that truckload of hay. Can you guide for us? Can you drive for us? Is what he would say. I'd say, yeah. What he meant was that when we got to the hay field, I was probably about 6, 7 years old. When we got to the hay field, what he would do is he would line the truck up, and all I had to do, then he would pull a throttle or the choke out just a little bit so the truck would move real slow while the guys threw on the hay and stacked it on the back of the truck. So I would guide the truck. He would tell me where he wanted to go. He'd say, see that tree over there? Okay, just go right straight to that tree. And I would just sit there and guide it. When we got there, then he would turn it around and back and forth. And for that, sometimes I might get a quarter, 25 cents. Just little things like that. So the store was where, most of us hung out. That's where Baptiste people, if you wanted to see someone, you go to the store around noon, and you would see all the people that you wanted to see. And one of the things about the mail was that Pat Patrick, he drove the van, and his wife was the postmaster. So when Pat brought the postmaster to Baptiste the mail, he also brought bread. So he brought bread, and then if people wanted to ride, like if you wanted to ride to Bethel, he would drop you off at Bethel for 15 cents. Mom and I used to sometimes take his van, ride with his wife and Pat, and go to Broken Bow, and that would be 50 cents each. So he operated a mail truck, bread truck, and also a taxi, I guess you could say. So there were things that a lot of people did because everybody was pretty much in the same boat. By that I mean economically, because most homes all had outdoor, no indoor plumbing, outdoor toilets. So very few houses had indoor plumbing. So everybody was pretty much in the same boat. So Benny would always have coal oil. Sometimes he would have white gas. White gas is the kind you would put in a lantern, in a gas lantern. And then outside his store, he would have oil racks where those people who had cars where they could drive up their vehicles and change oil or do whatever it is they wanted to do. So, so almost everything Benny did, it was always to support the community. So anyway, whenever I looked at that, when you look at Bethel, Ernest Wilson did the same thing there. Each community, there was someone who carried the community. One thing about Bethel at the time, I never thought about this, but Bethel was Ernest Wilson. He was the owner. And he would also purchase snake root. Because mom, sometimes on a typical day, sometimes mom said, I need some money, I need to do this. And she'd say, okay, we're gonna go over here somewhere in the mountains. And she said, I'm gonna dig snake root. So early in the morning, about 6, we'd get in the pickup. I was probably, I don't know, 8, 9. We'd get in the pickup and I'd drive her out there, and then I'd sleep while she worked until it got hot, usually around 10. But the snake root Ernest purchased was $16 a pound, and they used that snake root to make turpentine. So each store owner had their own way of doing things, but it was always to help the community. But whenever I think about it, I think about the ingenious way that a lot of people did things. Because sometimes I remember Miss Hornbeck, she came over and she said that her husband had cleared property where they were going to plant hay. And she wondered if mom and us, the kids, would go out there and help them clear that, pick up all the tree limbs and big rocks and stuff and clear that. So we would go out there and do stuff like that. And I don't know what they got paid, but we would go, mom would say, well, we're going to go do that. We're going to go help them out. And we would do that. And then there was not too far from where we lived, Jim Stevens, his son-in-law had purchased a chicken house. So they raised chicken fryers. And also eggs. So Jim made a deal with Dad. He said, Aaron, I get a lot of cool eggs, eggs that we can't sell. So he said that if you want, you can have it for 15 cents a dozen. So we always had eggs, because every 2-3 days I would go down, and my brothers and sisters, we would go down and get some eggs. And sometimes, they'd say, we had some extra fryers, and we get a couple extra chickens, bring that home. So we never really hurt for anything. Now, within the Choctaw community, if Uncle Dan killed a hog, then since very few people had refrigerators, those days, I remember we called it icebox. But very few people had icebox, so unless you ate the meat quickly, you couldn't keep it long. So they would always share with different people. So it was, everybody would share in that one hog. Now, Dad, something he had learned in CC camp was that he had a refrigerator, and it was hooked up to butane, and I think there was either a 50 or 100-gallon butane. And it was hooked up to the refrigerator. So we had an ice box that was, that operated 24 hours a day. So in that regard, we were fortunate. In addition to that, he had a gas lantern. So although we had coal oil lamps, we always had the lantern, and it always hung up in the middle of the front room, the living room. So in that sense, I think that living in Baptiste and being able to do a lot of things that mom and dad, approved of, just so that, we could further our education. And and with the backing with all my uncles. Uncle Floyd had served in World War II in France. He had made the Normandy landing, so he had a lot of good ideas about a lot of things. And he was a farmer. And Uncle Dan had been in Germany in World War II, and he had a lot of ideas. And then there was Uncle Jimmy. Him, we didn't see too often because being there was Jimmy and Edith, and then Uncle Owen. They were the three youngest. So what happened was that they had opportunities to go to school. So they went to school, they finished high school, and then Uncle Jimmy went on to Haskell. And Edith, she also went to Wheelock and Chilocco, and Uncle Owen was able to go to Haskell. So they were educated, somewhat educated, and Mom had gone to Dwight Mission. So in their own way, they kind of knew that there was a whole different world out there. So they were constantly pushing us that you need to learn this so you can take care of yourself. Mother's thing used to be, you need to learn how to do this because I'm not going to live forever. One of these days you're going to be on your own. So I think I probably heard that every day of my life. And she pushed us so that all her kids knew how to wash, iron, cook. And that was one of her pet peeves, is that it didn't matter how much the clothes or how much the pants were all patched up. He said, as long as it's clean and ironed, that's okay. It's the best we can do. And that was that. And we understood that. And I think, just having someone constantly push us, although at the time, we were so tired of it, I can say thank you now. Oh. But this is Baptiste, and there was a lot. It's probably about half and half. Half the population was probably Choctaws, and the other half was Anglos, because I never really had an opportunity to spend time or get to know any other race until I was about 8, when I spent the summer in New Mexico when I played baseball with Mexican kids. And then we saw blacks, in Broken Bow and Idabel, but I never really associated with them, and I didn't really know them until I played basketball against them in my high school years, junior and senior year. So I didn't really know any other race other than just Choctaws and Anglos. Anything else?
Well, someone was wanting to know, did you only speak Choctaw at home, or was it a mix of Choctaw and English?
Well, usually it was a mix but when I started school, I wasn't really all that phrased in English. There was a lot of things that I didn't know. My teacher was Miss Gertrude. Her name, actually, I didn't know her last name until probably I was in high school. But anyway, everybody called her Miss Gertrude. My older brother, he's 4 years older than me. She was his teacher and Lois's teacher, and Lois is 2 years older than me. But so what used to happen is that when I started school, well, first what happened was this. She gave us books, and every morning when we got to school, when class started, we were supposed to to learn our numerals, 1, 2, 3s. We were supposed to copy at the bottom of the book where the numerals were, copy it on the sheet of paper and turn it in. And she had given me a small book. So I was always the first one finished, because I only had to go, 40, 50. So she was explaining to me that I needed a larger book so I could, count a little higher or write a little higher. And I didn't understand. So I wouldn't do it. So that's when she realized that my English was limited. Then she called in my older brother and older sister. So in the morning, they would come with me, and then she would tell them what I need to be done for the morning. and then they would explain to me what needed to be done for the morning. And then at lunch, either Lois or Juno would come back and they would explain to me what needed to be done for the afternoon. And then in the evening, if I had homework, then one of them would come and explain to me what needed to be done for homework. So, yeah. So in that regard, I was kind of limited in speaking English. I could carry a conversation, but when you start talking about books and other things, and doing homework, I wasn't really all that interested. It could be that I just didn't care about learning. I don't know. But most of the people back home, or most of the Choctaws, I know that a lot of people did not speak Choctaw. A lot of people really had no formal education. So I think it was kind of difficult for them to negotiate, for example, making the transfer from North Bethel or Mount Zion Church, Mount Zion school, because sometimes, they only speak Choctaw at home and only spoke English at school. So sometimes I think they had that problems, because most of my uncles, we always spoke in Choctaw whenever I was home. So it was always Choctaw, except whenever we went to church, even church was all in Choctaw. Even Sunday school was all in Choctaw. So everything was Choctaw language. But still, there was things that I did not know, because I had a friend, his name was Joe Ludlow, and he would talk Choctaw to me, and sometimes I didn't understand the Choctaw he was using, because he was probably a little bit older than what I was accustomed to or used to. An answer?
Yeah, that's great. So you said that you didn't understand because it was like a different kind of dialect and he was from a different community. Is that what it was?
No, I think he was using older Choctaw words.
Oh, I see.
Because I remember the first time he went home with me from school. We were walking down the road, and he saw the house over there, and he said, "Boko pa ka naman kasyata." And I didn't know what are you talking about? Then he said, "You live on that hill, on that hill, house on the hill." And I said, "Yeah," but he would use certain words that I did not know, like boko. I had never heard that. Just little things like that. And then, just sometimes, like a church work day, or we'd go to somebody's house and work, and there was a word called "equa." It meant that somebody might say, "We're going to have equa at somebody's house this coming Saturday." What that meant was everybody would gather, and it would be a work day to help that person either build a house, build a barn, or do something. So, those kinds of words, sometimes I did not know, because Joe, that was his name. So he had an uncle who would sometimes, we would go to his house, and he would also use words that I had never heard. So I'm thinking it was probably the real Choctaw words that came from Mississippi here.
Yeah, that definitely kind of makes sense, because Dora will be like, "Oh yeah, I haven't heard that word unless it's a really kind of older kind of family or older person. Like they use specific words that are less commonly used." Yes, I think there was another question. And then can you tell us a little bit more about the churches that you grew up in and what was it like there? Oh, someone had asked, what was your favorite food as a kid?
Probably I hate the buha.
What's that?
Potatoes. We grew up eating potatoes because Dad had to have potatoes every meal. Breakfast, it was at lunch, it was breakfast, dinner, and supper. That's what we had. breakfast, dinner, and supper. So he would always save his potatoes for breakfast because he got up early and then he usually left the house around 7:30, 7:15, 7:30, depending on where his ride was. But anyway, what was the question?
Well, the
My
question
favorite,
was, what was your favorite food? And then you
yeah,
just started talking about potatoes.
yeah, potatoes, because Dad used to always call it Irish potatoes, and they were usually big potatoes, probably about that big, maybe 6 inches. They were big potatoes, and Dad always had a vegetable garden. It was big garden, so we had all kinds of vegetables. So sometimes, we would eat out. Well, during the summer, we would eat out of the garden. All the food came out of the garden, and then probably when you start getting cold, Dad also had a smokehouse. So we would put all the potatoes. He would go to my uncle's house and borrow one of those scythes, and then he would cut hay, and then he would lay it all on the floor of the smokehouse. Actually, it was a dugout because it was in the ground. It also served as a storm cellar. But during the let's say fall, we put all the potatoes down there, covered all with hay. In addition to that, Mom would stock her canned fruit and stuff in there too. So we always had that potatoes and then the store bought potatoes that Dad always called Irish potatoes. So we had usually three different kinds of potatoes. Sometimes it just varied. We also had sweet potatoes. So so there was Irish potatoes, sweet potatoes, and then Dad, what Mom called new potatoes. Those are whenever they just came out of the ground. Because Mom would say, "Go get some potatoes," and just get a bucket and go out there and dig it up, wash it, and then she would cook it. So it was probably potatoes.
What other foods did you grow in your garden, and where did you get the seeds?
There was always onions, there was potatoes, there was cantaloupes, there was watermelon, there was corn, uh, and the seeds, if I remember correctly, they were ordered from either Montgomery Ward, Sears, or National Balance Hess. So we always got those real thick catalogs about once a year, Montgomery Ward and Sears. So, and National Balance Hess is probably about an inch thick. So Mom would usually order from those. So I think that's where they got their seeds. But then again, Dad used to his my uncles, Uncle Floyd and Dan, they were farmers. So they always had big gardens and they had acres and acres of corn. So there was really no problem in getting seeds. The interesting thing is that they always relied on the farmer's almanac to tell them when to plant. So we always had a farmer's almanac hanging on the wall. There was three things on the wall that we did not touch. One was a big picture, a group picture of Dad's CC camp, I guess, a group. It was probably about 100 men. And then there was Dad's diary. It was a monthly diary that mom always filled in information because Dad had to always submit a monthly diary, day-to-day event at the end of the month. So once a week, they would sit down and they go, "Okay, what'd you do these dates?" And Dad start pulling out pieces of paper and, "Okay, we went to Flashman Tower on this day, and we did this, we did that," and she would write it all in. And then there was the almanac. So those three things we were not allowed to touch. So it had a sacred spot on the wall. But anyway, sometimes Uncle Dan, Uncle Floyd come over, or we'd go over there, and then they would argue about when to start planting, when to do this, when to do that. And since Dad was working full time, he couldn't do it on a certain day. And Uncle Dan, Uncle Floyd, they worked they didn't have a full-time job, so they could do at will because they had to coordinate when they were going to use the mules. Uncle Floyd had two mules, Nip and John. Nip was a mean one, so we left that alone. John, that was a good mule because you could even ride it. So we used to ride John. And Uncle Dan had Red and Rabbit. And Red was a mean one, so we stayed away from him. But Rabbit, he was a gentleman, so we could use him for plow. And then Uncle Walter, where he lived, he had a mule named Gray. So that's the one we used most of the time. But using the Farmer's Almanac, that's how we planted all of our stuff. Now, I mentioned Cleveland Billy, the youngest of Mom's brothers. They called him Farmer because he liked to farm. He liked to do things. So one time, I was in Oklahoma City spending the summer at his house, and we were eating. We had gone to Spring Lake or the amusement park or someplace, and we was eating popcorn. And I was asking him where popcorn came from. He said, "You can grow it." And he said, "Well, how do I do that?" And he said, "Well, he said, you just take the popcorn, you plant it." So I came home. When I came home, I asked Dad, I said, "Can I have a row?" Because he's planting corn. And I said, "Can I have a row? Because I'm going to plant popcorn." He says, "Oh, uh-huh." That's all he used to say. He didn't say, "Okay." He said, "Uh-huh." So I planted a row. And sure enough, lo and behold, I raised popcorn. But yeah, a lot had to do with farming. So, I loved potatoes, and I guess I still do. But when I think about it, it's a different kind of potatoes now. It seems like that one we have today. Hope answers your question.
Could you also tell about? I know you also ate squirrel. I'm sure people would love to hear about how you acquired squirrel to eat.
Where we lived, another Baker family lived not too far away from us. That was Simpson Baker and his family. And Simpson had, there was Tommy, there was Alton, Melton, Jimmy Dale. Jimmy Dale was about the same age as my older brother, JR. So he was always at the house. And their nephew, Elwood, he was same age as Lois, my older sister. And he and I, he used to hunt all the time because he had his uncles to help, who took him hunting all the time. So he was only 2 years older than I, and I was probably, I don't know, 7, 8, and he was about 10. But he is the one who taught me how to hunt. I had a 22. I used to use Dad's 22, and I was probably, I don't know. Anyway, the gun was, the 22 rifle was longer than I was tall, and it was heavy, so I had to carry with 2 arms. So Elwood made me a sling and put it over my shoulder so that it would help me carry that. But on Saturdays, usually we would go hunting, and then when he had real good eyes. Whenever he spotted something, he'd say, "Okay, you need to look for this. Look for this. You see that tree? You look for this." And usually, most of the squirrels that we had, they were gray squirrels, because there was gray squirrels and there was fox squirrels. Fox was sort of brown in color. So most of it was usually fox squirrels that we got in this certain area. And he'd say, I see a squirrel, so you stay here and I'll go around. Because whenever he went around, the squirrel would go around on the backside. Then I would see it. Or sometimes depending on who was going to shoot. So he would go around, then whenever it came around, then I would shoot it. Or vice versa. But he's the one who taught me how to hunt. And sometimes, we would have maybe 8, 10 squirrels. And what Mom used to do with that is usually when we brought in squirrels, we would clean it up, and then she would sometimes cook the squirrels, fry it just like it was, cut it up and fry it like you fry chicken, fry it. Or sometimes, she would cook it for a little while, and then she would put gravy in it. So sometimes we had squirrel and gravy. And the best part about the squirrel was that, we like to suck the brains out. So once it was cooked, we would always fight over who got the head, because that it was warm and soft and gooey. But yeah, we used to have squirrels, and also we used to have rabbits every now and then. We also had rabbits, and normally it was usually deer, rabbits, or squirrel. But squirrel most of the time, because there was abundance of squirrels, and most of the people around there either had deer dogs, or they had squirrel dogs, or they had coon dogs. But Elwood said, we don't want to take squirrel dog because they're too noisy. So we would always go, just the two of us, and probably, I don't know, for a long number of years we used to go hunting all the time, and he lived not too far away, so I saw him all the time. And then his Uncle Charlie, he had just came back from the Air Force, and sometimes he would come by the house, and we would go to the post office. So he was also someone I hung out with, and he would always talk about Nebraska, where he'd been stationed. So that was another source of information that I learned a lot about a lot of different things. But there was deer seasons, but I think it would be said that most of my uncles, did not adhere to the laws about deer season. So sometimes Anderson would come by the house and say, "Aaron, hiciste dali?" And what he meant was that he had a load of pine, because you use pine for kindling for our fireplace. And what he was saying was that underneath all that pine was a deer. So they would take it out, hang it out in the back, and skin it. So we'd have deer meat, or there was hog meat, or there was squirrel, or there was rabbit. So there was always meat on the table.
Thoroughly entertaining. Yeah, that was fun. That was great. Loved it. Someone wanted to know, how are your dogs fed and how were they housed?
Dogs, they were all outside dogs. All the dogs, I think I had never seen an in-house dog until probably when I came to California. No, I take that back. Yes, it is. Until I came to California, where I saw an in-house dog, an in-house cat. But most of the dogs were always outside. And Dad had just found a place, on the side of the barn, and had just put hay there. And that's where the dog's name was Brownie. That's where Brownie lived. But Brownie, Brownie was he was just a dog. He wasn't a hunting dog or anything. So he would just go wherever we went. But he was not allowed to ride in the truck or anything like that. He was a stay-at-home dog. But normally, whenever we fed them, it was from table scraps. So they ate table scraps. After Dad retired and he was taking care of one of his grandson's dogs, then he would buy dog food and mix it with table scraps and feed both. But that was an outside dog too. So we never had an inside the house dog.
Yeah, I remember that. How Glenn's dogs would always up in Batiste, and Grandpa would give them the table scraps.
Yeah, but the dogs were important to him, and I think for most people, dogs had a special place in their heart because I remember Mom would say, "Okay, we're gonna go here. We're gonna stay 2 days." First thing Dad would ask us, "Who's gonna feed the dogs?" And she said, "No one has to feed them. You know, they're okay for 2 days."
Also, a couple of people wanted to know about the diary that you kept up in that sacred spot. What was it kind of for, and do you still have it? Yeah, why did Grandpa have that diary?
Oh, the diary's was for Dad's work. So each day, you know, as forest rangers, they didn't call them that. They just call them forestry boys. They they would go do different tasks. Sometimes they would maybe rebuild fire lanes, or sometimes they would, because the forestry division, they were responsible for a certain sector of Oklahoma. So they had to make sure, and usually the fire seasons was between March and April when the March winds came. That's what they used to call it, March winds. And what they would do is that they would clear fire lanes so on a certain day. So those is what Mom would log in every day of what they did 5 or 6 days a week. So that's what they call a diary. So they would write that out, and then Dad would take it in at the end of the month, and then that would be filed away. It's basically the same things that the Marine Corps used to do. Is that each unit files a unit diary, so that if someone says, "I was injured on that day," they can go back and look to see if he was injured on a certain day at a certain time, it would be entered in that unit diary. So it was just to keep track of what they did every day while at work. But that was the diary.
And then someone else wanted to know, what newspapers and magazines did people in the community read?
The Daily Oklahoman used to come. Most of the time, we did not have newspapers that I can recall as a kid growing up until probably around fifth or the sixth grade, because I was not really aware of newspapers until I think I was in the seventh grade. Whenever our superintendent, his name was Raymond Anderson, our superintendent was my science teacher. So at the beginning of each class, as soon as the bell rung and we all got in their seats, he would bring out his Daily Oklahoman. Usually they were probably a day or two later than when it was published, but he would come in the mail, and he would pick up his mail, and the class was right after lunch. So for the first 15 minutes, he would read what he called important news from the newspaper. And he would read different things and just tell us that you need to be aware of world events, all these stuff. And there's one that I've never forgotten, is that because he was talking about Dag Hammarskjöld being killed in an airplane accident. And he kept saying that he was a member of our government. You need to know the government people. You need to know who your president. So that's how I remember that. But growing up, we didn't really have newspapers. No, I take that back. Daily Oklahoman must have been published before that, because on Sundays, Harry Benton, he lived in Sherwood. He would sometimes drive up on a Sunday and sell Dad a newspaper. Probably about every other Sunday, he would come up and early in the morning and bring newspapers. He was delivering newspapers. Okay, there was that. Now, when I was probably around 7 or 8, my older brother, he had a paper route. It was called Grit, Grit. It was a weekly newspaper, and he would come every Friday, and my brother would pick it up, and he would make his rounds. And then whenever he started playing basketball and sports and doing other things, and he also spent a lot more time with Uncle Floyd and Uncle Dan, because they had horses, and cows and stuff, and he liked to. Once he started playing basketball and started having a ball practice and stuff like that, he gave me the paper route. So on Fridays, I would pick up the newspapers at noon, and then I would sort it out. And I had about 15, maybe 20 regular customers. And I would get about 25 newspapers, but I would make my deliveries, I don't know, 5, 6 mile radius on a Friday evening. And this is very interesting because, most of my customers were the elderly. So sometimes I would go to, it might be kind of cloudy, it might be kind of rainy, and I would go to Miss Pinniger's house, and she would always say, "Oh, I was about to have a sandwich. Sit down, I'll make you a sandwich." And then she would ask about the community. At the time, I didn't realize that, but I was bringing news to her. And I got a sandwich, cheese sandwich. Because, she would make a cheese, she would have what we call light bread, and then she would put the cheese on that, and then she would cook, heat it up in the oven, open, and the cheese would get all brown. Oh, it used to be good. But anyway, that used to happen, and I had sometimes the other older men, they would offer me something to drink, depending on whether it's hot or cold. But I had that paper route for a long time. It cost, the grit was 10 cents, coming from Williamsport, Pennsylvania. So I would make maybe, I don't know, 6 cents went to them and 4 cents was my profit. So 25 cents, I made $1. But you have to remember, $1 went a long ways those days. A bottle of pop was 5 cents.
And these were all English newspapers. Because when I look in the archives, there's lots of Choctaw language newspapers. So there's none of that.
Yeah, they were all English. Now, Back East being where it's located, I think we were the only Choctaw family. We only lived about a quarter mile from the store. Probably the furthest we lived away is probably about a mile. A number of the Choctaws lived maybe away from there, maybe 3 or 4 miles out, let's say outside of town. So I was always at the post office every day except Sundays. Even on Sundays, sometimes I'd go there to meet someone. But that was a meeting place, so I was there all the time because, Mom didn't always have something for me to do because she always had, different things. And I think it would be fair to say that I was probably the most active one. It was always getting into trouble. So yeah, I don't think I ever saw a Choctaw newspaper written in Choctaw.
Okay. Someone asked, when did you see your first TV?
I think Dad purchased his pickup, I think in 1956. It was a 1953 Ford pickup. So once he got that, then we started going to different people's homes, and some of the people had TV. Not everybody had TV, but some people had TV. Then that's when I started watching TV. But I knew these people because we went there all the time, or we seen them, or they'd been to the house. So sometimes I could just say, "Mom, I'm going to the Gammons and watch TV." So I would go in, in the evening. I would stay there till about 8, 9 o'clock when they were going to bed. Then I would go home. So it was not unusual for me to go to different people's houses, just show up and watch TV. There was no such thing as call first and all that. You just showed up, and it was okay. But yeah, because I used to go to Gammons quite often, simply because their daughter was my classmate, and then the son was my sister's classmate. So we had something in common. So just being around them and watching TV. So yeah, because ourselves we didn't. Mom did not purchase a TV until Ray was probably in about fifth grade, sixth grade. I remember that because Ray used to run home and watch a certain program every day after school because it came on at 3:30 and they got out of school at 3:10. Okay.
What are some of the best memories you have of your parents and grandparents? Someone's asking.
I think just being with my uncles. My grandpa, before he passed, he used to always come to the house around noon because he was come picking up the mail. And then he would come onto the house. He was riding the horse. Its name was Sergeant. Though he would always ride the horse to the house. And when he came, he always brought sardine and crackers. So we'd always have sardine and crackers. And then JR, my older brother, and I, we would take Sergeant to a stream about a quarter mile away and water it. And he would stay and visit for a while, and then a couple hours, and he would go home. So we spent a lot of time at his house and with my uncles, and they were always telling, they were, at least to me, I always heard stories about things in France, things at the army post, things of this sort, things that they had learned, things that they had seen. The same with Uncle Dan. He would talk about things in Germany and some of the horrors he had seen. Uncle Dan had been instrumental in liberating one of the POW camps, so sometimes he would talk about how horrible it was, things of that sort. So we heard stories like that, and Uncle Owen would also talk about, Korea. What happened was that Jimmy, Edith, and Uncle Owen were Dad's younger brothers. So since the older ones were off in war or going someplace, either in the army or being away from home, and then my grandfather was a circuit rider, so he was gone maybe weeks at a time. So, and my dad had been just released from the CC camp. So it turned out that he was the one who had a full-time job. And once he married Mom, in a way, they sort of raised Edith and Owen. So those four were really close, Mom, Dad, and Edith and Owen. So Owen, we used to see him all the time because he was a young guy. He had a 1950 Chevrolet, and he just came out. He had just graduated high school, had gone into the army, and he was going to college at Haskell. So sometimes he would come whenever he was home. He would always come to the house. And the reason I remember this vividly is because he would always have 5 or 6 eggs. Mom would say, "You want to eat?" I said, "Yeah." "What do you want?" 5 eggs. And she would fry him 5 eggs or whatever he wanted. But I remember him, vividly, coming to the house. And what was your question?
Oh, just what was your favorite memories?
Oh, yeah. So spending summers, the winter cold, sometimes cold winter days at Uncle Floyd and Uncle Dan. Uncle Dan also, his wife, Aunt Blindy, her name was Blindy, we call her Blinty, is that she was a heavy-set woman, so everywhere she went, she'd always hitch up the horses, Red and the Rabbit, and she would ride the wagon. So sometimes she would ride her wagon to the house, and then when she went home, sometimes, either myself or one of my brothers and sisters, we would go tag along. We would ride the wagon all the way there and then walk back. Just stuff like that. So we spent a lot of time, riding the horses, uh, being around them, watching them milk cows, sometimes, just feeding hogs. And all that stuff was very interesting. And then Uncle Floyd, he also had a hay baler, and he had the rake. That was and also some kind of machinery that would cut hay. So it was all pulled by horses. So sometimes, whenever he was doing that, we would go out and watch him because, we could never figure out how that worked. But anyway, there was always something exciting going on the farm. So we spent a lot of time there. And Mom began to push us about that that I needed to go out and see the world. Not exactly in those terms, and it was said in Choctaw, but I didn't know this, but apparently she and Farmer had decided I was going to go spend Uncle Cleveland, which is Farmer. He was a career Air Force, so he was stationed at Tinker base in Oklahoma City. So they had decided I was going to go spend the summer at Oklahoma City, and since he had a young son, I would be a companion to his young son while they live in the city. So one day before Farmer came, she said that she said, I want to talk to you. I said, all right. And she said, you remember what Gabriel John said? Gabriel John was a pastor of our church. And that Sunday before, he had talked about the bright lights. Had something to do with how the bright lights can be educational, or the bright lights could make or break you. So yeah, it was important that we understood what the bright lights were. She was talking about the city. So she said, you remember what he said? He said that if you go see the bright lights, then, with Farmer there to help you, you learn the good about the bright lights. So that's that's what she used to get me to go going to Oklahoma City with my Uncle Farmer, because I had never been away from home, that far away from home. So anyway, I went and spent the summer in Oklahoma City. That's where I had my first Fritos. That's where I had my first foot-long chili dog. That's the first time at Spring Lake Amusement Park. All those things were sort of introduced to me. And I remember when we first got to Oklahoma City, Farmer got, the hot dogs and Fritos. And I liked RC Pop, Royal Crown. So he got me that. And we sat on the floor. He said, we're going to have a picnic. So we sat on the floor, kitchen floor, and we ate. That's what I remember. But my uncles always did stuff like that to make it interesting. And I think that's what I appreciate today, because I learned so much how to deal with kids. Because, they didn't have to do these things, but it's just something that they did. And it's the same thing with Mom, Dad had taken Lois and I to Wright City Rodeo. Mom said something about it. Aaron, you need to show it on the rodeo. So I said, all right. So we got ready and we went to Wright City, watch the rodeo. And Dad gave Lois and I 20 cents each to spend. So after the rodeo, we went to the carnival, and we had snow cones. So when we came back, we told Mom about it, and she says, I don't know how to make it, but, we can try. So she tried to make snow cones for us. Stuff like that, she'd always do stuff like that. If she went to a restaurant, we call it cafe then, and she had certain food, she would come home and try to duplicate it. So sometimes, we eat things that we didn't want, but thought we better eat it anyway.
Someone else wanted to know, what was your grandfather's name, the minister Baker? And then Sandra wanted to know if you had any stories from your grandparents as well.
That was Robinson Baker. His wife was Ineda. Grandfather Baker died in 1955, so I didn't really know him, except whenever I used to see him, riding the horses. Because, like I said, he wasn't home all that often. He was often gone. And Grandpa Billy in Broken Bow, we stayed at his house, and him I didn't see. I really didn't see him that much. Another point here is that Lois and I, we were born in his home, and my grandfather Billy is the one who brought us into the world. So Lois and I didn't have birth certificates, so we had to get delayed birth certificates later on. But I remember the time that we spent at his house. Probably the person I really remember is Khaleesi. Her name is Gracie, because she always, as mom's sister, she always came and stayed with us for a month or two at different times. And then Sam, Uncle Sam, I remember he used to take Junior and I, JR and I, fishing. He called it Boklusa. I guess it was, that's where we used to go. And I remember he used to say, wear long sleeves because sapontak adlawa, meaning that sapontak meaning mosquitoes. He says there's a lot of mosquitoes, so wear long sleeves and long pants. And Uncle Daniel, I didn't see him too often because he lived in Oklahoma City, and we didn't see him too much. I just remember that he always drove Pontiacs. So Uncle Ed, he lived in Broken Bow, so we saw him quite often because we used to visit his house quite often. And Farmer, he also lived in Oklahoma City while he was in the Air Force, so we didn't get to see him. But I did spend a lot of summers, in Oklahoma City with Aunt Rose. If you see this here, Aunt Rose made that. These two here. Yeah. Maybe Aunt Rose Billy.
Yeah. If you guys go to Labor Day and you go to the Choctaw Village, it's always Aunt Rose usually who's showing how to make Choctaw baskets. So that's her. But also, what about your grandmothers? You said the grandfathers weren't around, but what about your grandmothers?
I never knew them. They passed on before I was born. That explains why sometimes like my grandfathers, they had, they were married twice because, the wives, died and they had a second wife. So that's why you have Anderson Winship and then Dad, and then you have Gladys. They had different moms, same father.
I see. That makes sense. I think we're starting to run out of time. So, is there anything else that you wanted to add, tell us about before, or do you have a fondest memory with your sibling? Cody wants to know. So that could be your last question.
I think what I remember most is that my older brother and sister, JR, I remember he told me once, he had gotten married early, and then by early, I mean, he was still, he was probably about 17, 18 when he married. So he was working in Broken Bow, and he told me that, he said, I was in ninth grade. I had just finished ninth grade, I think. And he said that if you want a job for the summer, he said, come to Broken Bow, and then I'll introduce you to who I'm working for. He was working for Oklahoma University archaeological excavation team, and he said maybe you can get a job. So that afternoon after school, I hitchhiked to Broken Bow and went to his house. And the next morning, he walked me up to Charles Wesley and he said, he pointed him out. He said, that's Don Wyckoff. He's the man who's in charge of this team. He said, it's up to you now. So I said, okay. So I went and I talked to him and I got the job. And what I'm getting at is that my brothers and sisters, my older ones, they were very good at helping, but they would only go so far, which now I realize, it was to my advantage. He said that I can't carry you forever. So you need to learn how to do this on your own. And the same thing with Lois. Whenever I graduated high school and I came to California, when I first got here, she took me to LA. Well, she took me to a Dodger game. Then she took me to use the bus. She taught me how to use the bus. And after a few days of that, she said, "You're on your own." So, so in that regard, I think those are probably the best times I've had because I treated Joyce and Harold basically the same way. Is that I would go so far than say, "You're on your own." I think you've heard that, and Cody's heard that. So I think those are what I remember best because I can't help but be very appreciative and thankful that they did that. So that instead of doing it for me. So that's probably the fondest.
I know I said that was the last question, but this last question that someone sent is really great too. She asked if you have any advice for younger generations of Choctaws, I guess.
Especially back home, I think that it would be to their advantage for kids back home to travel a little bit more, do a little bit more than what's required of you in school. Do to use an old cliche is do things outside the box. Think outside the box because the whole world has changed so much since the time I was a kid. And I think that if it was not for my parents being progressive in the way that they were, is that I wouldn't be where I am today. Because a lot of the kids that I grew up with, they have their own lives, but it's a different kind of life. And if that's what you want, there's nothing wrong with that. But for me, I always had this idea that go west, young man, and that's just exactly what I thought. And just like I graduated high school on a Friday night, and then the next morning I left for California, not knowing what was here, but knowing that I knew enough, I could do enough. For example, FFA, I learned a lot from Jack Savage, and a lot of my classmates gave me a hard time because they said, you do all that work for nothing. They don't pay you. What they didn't realize was that I was learning how to weld, use cut and torch, spray paint, do some electricity wiring, woodwork, all these things that I learned in 4 years of FFA. I learned all of that. So, I still do a lot of that stuff around my own house here today is that I do my own work. So just like FFA, it was a godsend to me. It's taught me a lot of things. So it gave me the confidence to come to California and be able to ask for jobs. I landed in California on a Tuesday night. By Friday night, I was working Western Greyhound Line. So what I'm saying is that, you need to think outside the box. And parents need to push their kids to do maybe 120% rather than 100. That's a personal opinion.
Well, thanks, Dad, for doing the Chahta Tasholi and everything that you've helped us become good Choctaw people, I think. And so that's kind of all that we have for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. if you enjoyed these kinds of oral histories, remember you can always do this with members of your family. In the June 2020 Biskinic, we have an oral histories guide, so you could also do a variation of this with your own family. So go ahead and check that out if you haven't seen it already. Our next Chahta Chisholi is going to be Jennifer Byram, my fellow research associate here at Historic Preservation and a PhD student in archaeology at the University of Arizona. She will be sharing her work on revitalizing Choctaw textiles and artistic production. And so that will be Thursday, January 21st at 1 p.m. So see you all then. Thanks.